The sun was setting over a quiet coastal town, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. Rear Admiral James Carter, a decorated naval officer known for his calm demeanor and years of service to the nation, had just returned home from an overseas deployment. He was driving through familiar streets in his modest sedan, eager to spend time with his family after months at sea. The roads were mostly empty, and the evening air carried a sense of peace. Little did James know that this seemingly ordinary drive would turn into one of the most harrowing experiences of his life. As he approached a dimly lit intersection, 2 police cars suddenly appeared out of nowhere, their flashing blue and red, lights piercing through the twilight. Confused but cooperative, James slowed down and pulled over immediately. He assumed there might have been some misunderstanding, a broken taillight perhaps, or a minor traffic violation. But what happened next left him stunned and shaken to his core. A group of officers stepped out of their vehicles, shouting aggressively and pointing guns directly at him. One officer barked orders, accusing James of reckless driving despite no such behavior on his part. The situation escalated quickly when one of them made derogatory remarks about his race, implying bias as the underlying motive behind the unwarranted stop. James's heart raced as he realized this wasn't a routine traffic check. It was something far more sinister. James remained composed, raising his hands slowly while trying to explain who he was, a high-ranking military official simply heading home. "I'm Rear Admiral James Carter," he said calmly, reaching for his identification, but his words fell on deaf ears. The officers refused to listen or even check his credentials. Instead, they demanded he step out of the car, treating him like a criminal. Passers-by began gathering around, witnessing the alarming scene unfold. For James, it wasn't just about being humiliated. It was about standing up against blatant injustice without losing his composure. Though terrified, he knew he couldn't let fear dictate his actions. The tension thickened as the officers continued to bark commands. One of them, Officer Daniel Hayes, seemed particularly hostile. His tone was sharp, his body language aggressive. He approached James's car with his gun drawn, yelling accusations that made no sense. "You think you can speed through here like you own the place?" Hayes snapped, ignoring James's repeated attempts to clarify that he hadn't broken any laws. Other officers joined in, reinforcing Hayes' hostility. It was clear they weren't interested in listening. They had already decided James was guilty. James felt a mix of emotions, anger, frustration, and disbelief. How could this be happening? He had served his country faithfully for decades, earning respect and admiration from colleagues and civilians alike. Yet here he was, held at gunpoint by men who were supposed to protect and serve. The irony wasn't lost on him. As the minutes dragged on, James tried to stay focused. He reminded himself that panicking wouldn't help. He needed to remain calm, not just for his sake, but also for the sake of those watching. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about setting an example of how to handle injustice with grace and dignity. Eventually, the confrontation came to a head. Hayes ordered James to step out of the car, still pointing his weapon menacingly. With no choice but to comply, James opened the door slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. As soon as he stepped onto the pavement, the officers surrounded him, handcuffing him roughly. The metal bit into his wrists, but James bit back a cry of pain. He locked eyes with Hayes, searching for a flicker of humanity in the man's cold gaze. There was none. By now, a small crowd had gathered, murmuring among themselves. Some recorded the incident on their phones, capturing every moment of the disturbing encounter. James noticed a young boy clutching his mother's hand, wide-eyed and frightened. In that instant, James understood the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just an attack on him. It was an assault on decency, fairness, and everything he stood for. He vowed silently that he wouldn't let this moment define him. If anything, it would strengthen his resolve to fight for justice. Hours later, James found himself sitting in a cold interrogation room at the local precinct. Despite producing identification proving his rank and affiliation with the Navy, the officers showed little regard for protocol or respect. They questioned him aggressively, twisting facts to fit their narrative. It became clear that this wasn't merely a case of mistaken identity. It was fueled by prejudice. Eventually, after intervention from higher authorities alerted by James's wife, he was released late into the night. Exhausted yet determined, he resolved not to let this incident go unnoticed. The next morning, news outlets picked up the story. Footage captured by bystanders during the traffic stop went viral, showing the shocking treatment James endured. Social media erupted with outrage as people demanded accountability. Journalists reached out to James, seeking interviews, but he chose to remain silent initially. Instead, he focused on filing a formal complaint with Internal Affairs, providing every detail of the harrowing encounter. His decision to pursue justice resonated deeply with communities nationwide, sparking protests and calls for reform. For James, the experience was both infuriating and eye-opening. He had always believed in the goodness of people, trusting that institutions like law enforcement existed to uphold justice. But this incident shattered that belief, forcing him to confront the harsh realities of systemic racism. At the same time, it ignited a fire within him, a determination to use his voice and influence to bring about change. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face whatever challenges lay in store. In the days that followed, James reflected on the events of that fateful evening. He thought about the officers who had treated him so unfairly, and wondered if they truly believed they were doing the right thing. Were they products of a flawed system, or did they harbor personal biases that clouded their judgment? These questions haunted him, but they also fueled his mission. James realized that his story wasn't just about him. It was about shining a light on the injustices faced by countless others every day. As the weeks passed, support poured in from all corners of the country. Civil rights organizations rallied behind James, offering legal assistance and amplifying his message. Strangers sent messages of encouragement, sharing their own stories of discrimination and resilience. James drew strength from these connections, knowing he wasn't alone in this fight. Together, they formed a powerful coalition determined to hold those responsible accountable and push for meaningful reforms. Looking back, James knew the ordeal had changed him forever. It had tested his patience, his faith, and his trust in humanity. But it had also revealed his inner strength and reinforced his commitment to making the world a better place. As he stood on the balcony of his home one evening, gazing at the stars, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was just the beginning of a long journey, but he was ready to take each step with courage and conviction. Hours passed before James finally found himself sitting in a cold, sterile interrogation room at the local police precinct. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the table where he sat. His wrists still bore faint, red marks from the handcuffs, a painful reminder of the ordeal he had endured just hours earlier. Despite showing his military identification and explaining his position as a Rear Admiral, the officers refused to acknowledge his credentials. Instead, they treated him like any other suspect, interrogating him aggressively and twisting facts to fit their narrative. The room was small and windowless, with peeling paint on the walls and a single chair that creaked under his weight. James tried to remain composed, but the frustration simmered beneath the surface. Each question lobbed at him felt more accusatory than the last. "Why were you speeding?" one officer demanded, even though James had been driving well within the speed limit. Another chimed in, "Do you think being in the Navy gives you special privileges?" Their tone dripped with hostility, making it clear they weren't interested in the truth. They wanted to justify their actions. James clenched his fists under the table, forcing himself to stay calm. He knew losing his temper wouldn't help. Instead, he answered each question patiently, sticking to the facts. "I wasn't speeding," he repeated firmly, "and I cooperated fully when you pulled me over." But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The officers exchanged smirks, clearly amused by their own authority. It was as if they took pleasure in belittling him, reducing a decorated naval officer to nothing more than a criminal in their eyes. Outside the precinct, chaos was brewing. News of the incident had spread quickly thanks to bystanders who recorded the traffic stop on their phones. Videos of James being surrounded by armed officers went viral almost overnight. Social media platforms lit up with outrage as people watched the shocking footage. Comments poured in from all over the country, condemning the officers' behavior and demanding accountability. Hashtags like #Justice for James and #End Racial Profiling began trending, amplifying the growing movement for reform. Back inside the interrogation room, James noticed a shift in the officers' demeanor. They became quieter, exchanging uneasy glances as if sensing the storm brewing outside. Still, they pressed on with their questions, determined to maintain control of the situation. At one point, Officer Hayes, the same man who had pointed a gun at James during the traffic stop, entered the room. His presence was suffocating, his eyes cold and unyielding. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching silently as his colleagues continued the interrogation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, James's wife arrived at the precinct. She had been contacted by a friend who saw the viral video and immediately sprang into action. With her came legal representation, a team of attorneys specializing in civil rights cases. When they entered the room, the atmosphere changed instantly. The officers straightened up, suddenly aware of the scrutiny they were under. One of them muttered something about releasing James soon, but the damage had already been done. As James walked out of the precinct late that night, cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions from behind barricades. Exhausted, but resolute, he ignored them, focusing instead on reuniting with his family. The relief of being free was tempered by the knowledge that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about exposing the systemic issues that allowed such incidents to happen in the first place. The next morning, the story dominated headlines nationwide. Major news outlets covered every detail of the incident, highlighting the racial undertones and the blatant misuse of power. Interviews with witnesses painted a vivid picture of the events, corroborating James's account and further discrediting the officers' claims. Civil rights organizations issued statements condemning the treatment James received and calling for immediate investigations into the department's practices. One organization, Justice Now, reached out to James directly. Their founder, Sarah Thompson, was a fierce advocate for victims of police brutality and systemic racism. Over the phone, she expressed her support and offered to help amplify his voice. "This is bigger than you, Admiral," she said earnestly. "Your story has the potential to spark real change. Will you let us stand with you?" James hesitated for a moment. He had always preferred to stay out of the spotlight, letting his work speak for itself. But this was different. This wasn't just about him. It was about standing up for everyone who had ever felt powerless against injustice. After a deep breath, he agreed. "Let's do it," he said firmly. "If telling my story can make a difference, then I'll tell it." With Justice Now's backing, James began preparing to go public. The team worked tirelessly to gather evidence, including witness testimonies, dashcam footage, and internal communications from the police department. They also researched the officers involved, uncovering a troubling pattern of misconduct and discriminatory behavior. It turned out that Officer Hayes, in particular, had a history of complaints filed against him, many of which involved racially charged language and excessive force. As the investigation unfolded, public pressure mounted. Protesters gathered outside the police station, holding signs that read, "Accountability now," and "No justice, no peace." Local leaders called for emergency meetings to address the growing unrest. Even politicians weighed in, urging transparency and accountability. The entire town, and soon the nation, was watching closely, waiting to see how the authorities would respond. Meanwhile, James focused on healing. The emotional toll of the incident lingered, manifesting in sleepless nights and moments of anger. He confided in his wife, who reminded him of his strength and resilience. Together, they leaned on their faith and community for support. Friends and neighbors rallied around them, offering words of encouragement and solidarity. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, James reflected on the journey ahead. "This isn't going to be easy," he admitted. But if we don't, fight for change now, when will we? His wife smiled softly, squeezing his hand. You've faced tougher battles before, she said, and you've always come out stronger. This time won't be any different. Buoyed by her confidence, James prepared to step into the spotlight. He knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but he also knew he couldn't back down. This wasn't just about seeking justice for himself. It was about paving the way for a better future. As he stood before the mirror rehearsing his first public statement, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was his moment to shine a light on the darkness, to turn pain into progress. And he was ready. By the end of the week, James's story had become a rallying cry for millions. People from all walks of life shared their own experiences of discrimination, flooding social media with stories of resilience and hope. For James, seeing this outpouring of support was both humbling and empowering. It reinforced his belief that no matter how daunting the odds, collective voices could drive transformative change. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in days, James allowed himself to feel a glimmer of optimism. The days following James's release from the precinct were a whirlwind of activity. News of his ordeal continued to dominate headlines, sparking heated debates across the country. Social media buzzed with outrage as more people watched the viral video of the traffic stop, their anger fueling calls for accountability. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, legal teams worked tirelessly to build a case against the officers involved. Every piece of evidence, dashcam footage, witness testimonies, internal communications was meticulously reviewed and cataloged. For James, this was no longer just about seeking justice for himself. It had become a fight for systemic change. One of the key figures driving the investigation was Sarah Thompson, the founder of Justice Now. Her team collaborated closely with James, ensuring that every detail of his story was documented and presented effectively. They knew they were up against powerful forces. The police department had resources, connections, and a long history of deflecting criticism. But Sarah was undeterred. "We're not backing down," she told James during one of their strategy meetings. "This is our chance to hold them accountable." As part of the process, Sarah arranged for James to meet with civil rights attorneys, specializing in cases involving police misconduct. These lawyers brought years of experience to the table, having represented countless victims of racial profiling and excessive force. Together, they mapped out a plan to file both criminal charges against the officers and a civil lawsuit against the department. The goal was twofold: punish those responsible and push for policy reforms to prevent similar incidents in the future. Among the officers under scrutiny, Officer Daniel Hayes stood out as the central figure. His aggressive behavior during the ICE traffic stop, coupled with his derogatory remarks, made him a prime target for prosecution. Internal affairs investigators dug into his past, uncovering a troubling pattern of misconduct. Multiple complaints had been filed against Hayes over the years, many alleging discriminatory treatment and unwarranted aggression. Yet, none of these complaints had led to disciplinary action. Instead, Hayes had risen through the ranks, seemingly untouchable. For James, learning about Hayes's history was infuriating but unsurprising. It confirmed what he already suspected, that the officer's actions weren't isolated incidents but part of a broader culture of impunity within the department. This realization only strengthened his resolve to see justice served. He spent hours reviewing documents and preparing for potential cross-examinations, determined to present an unshakable case. Meanwhile, public pressure mounted. Protesters gathered daily outside the police station, chanting slogans and holding signs demanding accountability. Local activists organized rallies, inviting speakers who shared their own harrowing encounters with law enforcement. One woman recounted being stopped repeatedly for minor infractions simply because of her race. Another man described how officers had brutalized him during a routine check, leaving him hospitalized. Their stories resonated deeply with the crowd, reinforcing the urgent need for reform. Politicians joined the chorus of voices calling for action. City council members held emergency sessions to discuss measures aimed at increasing transparency and accountability within the police force. Some proposed mandatory body cameras for all officers, while others advocated for independent oversight committees to review complaints of misconduct. Though progress was slow, the sheer volume of public support ensured that these discussions remained front and center. Back in the courtroom, preparations for the trial intensified. Prosecutors argued that Hayes's actions constituted criminal misconduct, emphasizing how his use of excessive force and racially charged language violated both ethical standards and the law. Defense attorneys countered by attempting to cast doubt on James's credibility, questioning whether his military rank influenced his perception of events. However, the overwhelming evidence, including video footage and consistent witness accounts, made it difficult for them to mount a convincing defense. James took the stand during the trial, recounting the events of that fateful evening calmly yet powerfully. As he spoke, jurors listened intently, their expressions reflecting a mix of shock and empathy. He described the fear he felt as guns were pointed at him, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal, and the frustration of being ignored. Despite presenting valid identification, his testimony painted a vivid picture of vulnerability and resilience, striking a chord with everyone in the room. Defense attorneys tried to discredit him, asking pointed questions designed to undermine his character. "Isn't it true that you could have handled the situation differently?" one lawyer asked, implying that James's demeanor somehow provoked the officers. James responded firmly, maintaining eye contact as he replied, "I did nothing wrong. I followed every instruction given to me. If anything, I showed extraordinary restraint considering the circumstances." Outside the courtroom, supporters rallied around James, offering words of encouragement and solidarity. Friends, family, and strangers alike expressed admiration for his courage, praising him for turning personal trauma into a catalyst for change. Murals depicting his face alongside slogans calling for reform began appearing on city walls, symbols of inspiration born from adversity. Finally, after weeks of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the judge announced the decision: guilty on charges of assault, unlawful detention, and hate speech. A collective gasp rippled through the audience, followed by murmurs of disbelief and relief. Hayes received a prison sentence, becoming one of the rare cases where accountability triumphed over institutional protection. News of the conviction sent shockwaves throughout the country, signaling a potential turning point in addressing police brutality and racism. For James, the verdict was bittersweet. While it marked a significant victory, he knew the fight wasn't over. Systemic issues ran deep, requiring sustained effort to dismantle. Still, the outcome gave him hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, light could emerge. As he left the courthouse surrounded by well-wishers, James allowed himself a small smile. This was just the beginning of a larger movement, and he was ready to lead the charge. In the days that followed, James reflected on the journey so far. From the terrifying night of the traffic stop to the grueling weeks of legal proceedings, every step had tested his patience, faith, and determination. But through it all, he had remained steadfast, drawing strength from his loved ones and the countless supporters who believed in his cause. Looking ahead, he knew there would be more battles to fight, more challenges to overcome. Yet he also knew he wasn't alone. Together, they were building a brighter, fairer future, one where justice wasn't just a dream but a reality for all. The conviction of Officer Daniel Hayes marked a pivotal moment, but for Rear Admiral James Carter, it was only the beginning. The courtroom victory sent ripples through the nation, sparking conversations about accountability and reform within law enforcement. However, James knew that real change wouldn't come from one verdict alone. It required systemic shifts, policies rooted in fairness, and a cultural overhaul within policing institutions. With renewed determination, he turned his focus toward advocating for these changes, determined to ensure that no one else would have to endure what he had. In the weeks following the trial, city officials convened emergency sessions to address the growing demand for reform. Public pressure had reached a fever pitch, with protests continuing outside police stations and government buildings. Protesters carried signs emblazoned with slogans like "Accountability saves lives" and "Justice without delay." Activists organized teach-ins, town halls, and marches, urging citizens to stay engaged and hold their leaders accountable. The energy was palpable, a testament to the power of collective action. James played a central role in these discussions, leveraging his platform to push for meaningful reforms. He partnered with Justice Now, civil rights organizations, and community leaders to draft comprehensive proposals aimed at addressing systemic racism within law enforcement. Among the key recommendations were mandatory anti-bias training for all officers, the implementation of body cameras, independent oversight committees to review complaints, and stricter penalties for violations of civil rights. These measures weren't just theoretical ideas. They were born out of lived experiences, including James's own harrowing encounter. One of the most contentious debates centered around the use of body cameras. Critics argued that they infringed on officers' privacy or created logistical challenges, while proponents insisted they were essential tools for transparency. James spoke passionately about this issue during a televised panel discussion, sharing how video evidence had been crucial in securing justice in his case. If not for those bystanders recording that night, my story might never have been heard, he said. Body cameras aren't just devices, they're safeguards against abuse of power. His words resonated deeply with audiences, swaying even some skeptics. Slowly but surely, progress began to materialize. City councils across the country adopted similar initiatives inspired by the changes enacted locally. Training programs emphasized empathy and cultural sensitivity, fostering better relationships between officers and residents. While challenges remained, the groundwork laid during this period represented a significant step forward. For James, seeing tangible improvements validated his decision to speak out, reinforcing his belief that courage and perseverance could drive transformative change. As reforms gained momentum, James also focused on amplifying marginalized voices. He understood that his position as a high-ranking naval officer gave him a unique platform, one he felt obligated to use responsibly. During interviews and public appearances, he consistently redirected attention to grassroots activists who had been fighting for justice long before his ordeal. "This isn't my movement," he often said. "It belongs to everyone who has ever stood up against injustice." He traveled extensively, speaking at conferences, universities, and community centers. Each speech was tailored to the audience, whether it was students eager to learn about advocacy or seasoned activists seeking strategies for sustainable change. In one particularly moving address, James recounted the fear he felt during the traffic stop and the frustration of being dismissed despite his credentials. "That night taught me something I'll never forget," he told the crowd. "No matter your rank, your title, or your achievements, you're still vulnerable to prejudice. If systems are broken, that's why we must fix them. Not just for ourselves, but for future generations." His authenticity struck a chord with listeners, inspiring many to join the cause. Social media campaigns gained traction, encouraging people to contact their representatives, attend rallies, and educate themselves on racial justice issues. Hashtags like #ReformNow and #StandWithJames trended regularly, keeping the conversation alive. Murals dedicated to James appeared in cities nationwide, featuring powerful imagery of resilience and unity. One mural depicted him standing tall, amidst a sea of protesters with the words "Courage leads the way" painted boldly above. Despite the progress, resistance lingered. Some members of law enforcement pushed back against the reforms, claiming they hindered their ability to do their jobs effectively. Others dismissed the calls for change as unnecessary, arguing that incidents like James's were isolated anomalies, rather than symptoms of deeper problems. James confronted these arguments head-on, using data and personal anecdotes to challenge misconceptions. At a meeting with local police chiefs, he presented statistics showing how communities thrived when trust between citizens and officers improved. "Reform isn't about punishing you," he explained. "It's about protecting everyone, officers included." His approach earned respect even among skeptics. Over time, more departments began embracing the proposed changes, recognizing that accountability and transparency strengthened public confidence. Training sessions became collaborative efforts, with officers and community members working together to identify solutions. James attended several of these workshops, offering insights based on his experience. His presence helped bridge gaps between groups that had historically been at odds, fostering dialogue and understanding. At home, James leaned on his family for support. The emotional toll of reliving his trauma during public appearances sometimes left him drained. His wife reminded him to take breaks, encouraging him to find moments of peace amidst the chaos. Together they took long walks along the coast, finding solace in the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore. Their bond grew stronger as they navigated this new chapter together, united by a shared vision of a better world. For James, the journey wasn't without its doubts and fears. There were nights when he questioned whether he was making a difference, whether the sacrifices were worth it. But then he'd receive messages from strangers thanking him for giving them hope, or see young activists organizing events inspired by his story. Those moments reaffirmed his purpose, reminding him why he couldn't give up. By the end of the year, the impact of James's advocacy was undeniable. Reforms had taken root in multiple jurisdictions, setting precedents for others to follow. Officers, trained under the new programs, reported improved interactions with the public, while citizens expressed greater trust in law enforcement. Though far from perfect, the system showed signs of healing, a testament to the power of persistence and collaboration. Reflecting on everything that had transpired, James felt a profound sense of gratitude. He thought about the officers who had wronged him, the legal battles he had fought, and the countless supporters who had stood by his side. This wasn't just his victory, it belonged to everyone who had dared to believe in a fairer, more equitable society. As he looked toward the future, James knew there would be more work to do. But for now, he allowed himself to feel proud of how far they had come. Together, they had turned pain into progress, proving that even in the face of adversity, hope could prevail. Months after the conviction of Officer Daniel Hayes and the sweeping reforms that followed, Rear Admiral James Carter found himself standing on a stage unlike any he had ever been on before. It was a crisp autumn morning, and the auditorium buzzed with anticipation as people filed in from all walks of life: activists, students, law enforcement officers, politicians, and ordinary citizens united by a shared desire for justice. The event was titled A Future Without Fear, a conference dedicated to advancing equality and reforming institutions plagued by systemic bias. James, dressed in his full naval uniform adorned with medals earned over decades of service, stood tall at the podium, ready to deliver the keynote address. As the crowd settled into their seats, James took a deep breath, scanning the sea of faces before him. He saw determination in some eyes, curiosity in others, and even skepticism in a few. But what struck him most was the collective hope radiating from the room. This wasn't just an audience. It was a movement, one that had grown exponentially since that fateful night when he was held at gunpoint. That moment, a personal ordeal, had become a symbol of resilience and a catalyst for change. Now, as he prepared to speak, James felt both humbled and empowered, knowing his words carried weight not only because of his rank, but because of the journey he represented. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady yet warm. "When I first agreed to stand here today, I wondered how I could possibly capture everything this past year has meant, not just to me, but to so many of you who have joined this fight. Then I realized something. This isn't my story alone, it's ours." He paused, letting the significance of those words sink in. "That night, when I was pulled over and treated like a criminal simply because of the color of my skin, was not just about me. It belongs to everyone who has ever felt powerless against injustice, to every parent who worries their child might not come home safe because of prejudice, to every officer who struggles daily to uphold integrity in a flawed system, and to every person who dares to dream of a world where fairness isn't negotiable, it's guaranteed." The room erupted in applause, but James raised a hand to quiet them. His tone shifted slightly, becoming more reflective. "I won't lie to you, it hasn't been easy. Reliving that night over and over again during investigations, trials, and interviews reopened wounds I thought had healed. There were moments when I questioned whether speaking out was worth it, Would anything really change? Or would we simply go back to business as usual once the headlines faded? He leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking onto the audience. But then I met people like Sarah Thompson, whose tireless advocacy reminded me that no battle is too big if enough voices rise together. I heard stories from strangers who reached out to share their own experiences of discrimination, reminding me that I wasn't alone. And I saw young activists organizing rallies, proving that courage doesn't have an age limit. These moments kept me going, showing me that progress isn't made by one person. It's built by communities refusing to stay silent. James went on to highlight specific victories achieved through collective effort. He spoke of cities adopting body cameras for police officers, departments implementing mandatory anti-bias training, and independent oversight committees being formed to review misconduct complaints. Each achievement, though incremental, represented a step toward dismantling systems rooted in inequality. Change never happens overnight, he said. It's messy, frustrating, and often slow. But look around you. Look at what we've accomplished. Together. If we can do this much in such a short time, imagine what we can achieve in the years ahead. His speech wasn't without its challenges. James acknowledged the resistance they still faced. Officers resistant to reform, politicians reluctant to allocate resources, and individuals dismissive of the need for change. There will always be obstacles, he admitted. People who tell us it's impossible, unnecessary, or too expensive. But let me remind you of something. History shows us that every great leap forward started with someone saying, "We can do better." So yes, there will be pushback. Yes, there will be setbacks. But none of that matters if we keep moving forward. As he neared the end of his address, James grew emotional. He thought about the young boy he'd seen that night, the one clutching his mother's hand, wide-eyed and frightened as officers surrounded his car. That image had stayed with him, haunting yet motivating. "I want to leave you with this," he said softly. "Every decision we make, every policy we implement, every word we speak shapes the world our children inherit. If we truly believe in justice, equality, and humanity, then we must act accordingly. Not tomorrow, not next year, but right now. Because the future depends on it." The room erupted in thunderous applause, standing ovations echoing throughout the auditorium. People wiped away tears, clapped until their hands stung, and cheered for a man who had transformed trauma into triumph. Outside the venue, murals depicting James alongside slogans calling for reform adorned city walls. They weren't just art. They were symbols of inspiration, reminders that even in the darkest moments, light could emerge. In the days following the conference, James reflected on the impact of his speech. Messages poured in from across the globe, thanking him for giving voice to the voiceless and inspiring others to take action. Activists cited his words during protests, while educators included his story in lesson plans about social justice. For James, seeing his message resonate so deeply reinforced his belief in the power of storytelling to drive change. Yet, despite the accolades, James remained grounded. He understood that true leadership wasn't about seeking recognition. It was about serving others. Whether mentoring young activists, consulting with policymakers, or simply listening to someone share their pain, he continued to use his platform responsibly. He often reminded himself of a phrase his father used to say, "A tree is known by its fruit." If his efforts bore fruit in the form of safer communities and fairer systems, then he had done his job. As time passed, James's legacy extended beyond accolades or titles. He became a beacon of hope, a living testament to the idea that courage and perseverance could overcome even the greatest odds. Schools named scholarships after him, honoring students committed to social justice. Community centers hosted programs, inspired by his advocacy, teaching participants how to engage constructively with law enforcement. Even within police departments, officers began referring to his speeches during training sessions, using his example to emphasize the importance of empathy and accountability. For James, the scars of that night lingered, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they served as reminders of how far he and society had come. He often visited the intersection where it all began, now marked by a plaque commemorating the incident and the subsequent reforms. Standing there, he felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that his struggle had sparked a movement larger than himself. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, James thought about the road ahead. Challenges undoubtedly remained, but he felt hopeful. Change was happening, not perfectly, not universally, but undeniably. And as long as people refused to accept injustice, there would always be reason to believe in a brighter tomorrow. With a contented sigh, James leaned back in his chair, gazing at the stars twinkling above. This journey had tested him in ways he never imagined, but it had also revealed his strength, resilience, and unwavering commitment to justice. As he closed his eyes, he allowed himself a rare moment of pride, not for what he had achieved alone, but for what they had achieved together. Together they had turned pain into purpose, adversity into action, and despair into hope. And in doing so, they had proven that even in the face of darkness, humanity could shine brightly.